For that lovely introduction. Yeah, so we're often referred to as the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, or worse. And one of the things that my clients always say to me at the end of a piece of litigation is, thanks so much for sorting that out, never want to see you again. And I take it as a compliment. And fortunately for some clients, we don't see them again, other than referring them through to, our corporate team and things like that to get some front-end advice. Others are getting some good frequent flyer miles through a range of it. So how do you mitigate your risk? And insurance is one piece of the puzzle, but there are a number of other things that you can be doing to try and mitigate your risk. I'd love to say to avoid your risk altogether, but unfortunately, that would do me out of a job, so I can't do that. And frankly, it's just impossible because things happen within your control and outside of it. So we'll cover a few things that might help. Success. So number one, know your risks. And this is something that Brigitte was touching on before about, sometimes you're asked to get a particular type or a particular amount of insurance. Sometimes that's entirely appropriate and actually would be really beneficial. Other times it's just not relevant to your business. So think about what your business is, what work you're actually carrying out, and if the insurance or the amount of insurance is justified for the work that you're carrying out. If you're a sprinkler company and you're asked to be carrying vibration insurance, I struggle to see the connection between those two things. If you're asked to get public liability insurance, so if something happens and another building is damaged, that would make more sense. But so just stop and think about what you're being asked, what work you're carrying out, and why that might be relevant. And don't be afraid to ask questions and ask what's. Sometimes people are trying to achieve something, but they're not quite sure how to get there. So if you have one of those, just a chat with them to figure out exactly what they're trying to achieve, there might be a better way forward. So at the risk of terrifying everyone, there are a bunch of risks, which you guys probably are all too aware of. So the first is contractual. So what risks are there in your contract with the contracting party? What risks are you agreeing to take on? And what risks are they agreeing to take on? The next is tortious. So this is your classic negligent misstatement. So saying something that's wrong and it causing some big problems later on. So you often if you ever have the pleasure of being sued, you often get sued both in contract and in tort, because those two duties of care are parallel and run side by side. Statutory, that's the other one. So allegations about building work not meeting the Building Act or the Building Code. Council prosecutions is a really nasty one. That's serious stuff. That's if you haven't met the building code and it's caused some serious damage. I think the most sort of infamous one recently was the Bella Vista developments in Tauranga. There were some serious prosecutions out of that. Fair Trading Act, so that's not misrepresenting you or your company or your employees' skills, qualifications and experience, and whether what you're doing is fit for purpose. Commerce Commission, price fixing, and professional disciplinary. So this is the other big part of my business, is acting for construction professionals who are not only being sued but are facing a professional disciplinary complaint. So that could be before Architects Board, Engineering New Zealand, those kind of things. And they've got some really wide and far-reaching, serious powers, which is kind of concerning sometimes. And they can have a really serious implications on your business. So do understand what can happen and work out what insurance you need to cover what risks you've got. WorkSafe and RMA, so that's what we're touching on previously, is that's what's called statutory liability. So that covers your liability and defence costs for if you are getting prosecuted by WorkSafe or under the Resource Management Act. And financial and insolvency. So understand who you are contracting with and what's going to happen if they go bust. Because it's all very well having this lovely contract with indemnities and things like that, but if that company goes bust, where does that leave you? What's the risk of them going bust, and what's going to happen to you and the project? And if you're the head contractor, you've got that what's called that non-delegable duties of care. So even if you've got a subbie that screws up, if they go bust, you're going to wear it. It's just the brutal reality. So one of the first things we always suggest is getting the right contract for the right person and the work. So sometimes some odd things that have come across my desk are 3910 contracts that should be a short form agreement for consultancy, and vice versa. So just stop and think about who you're contracting with, what you're trying to achieve, and whether the contract is appropriate or not. And if you're not sure, talk to someone who does know, because it does make a big difference. That's just a way thing. If you're dealing with individuals or anyone that could possibly be categorised as vulnerable, recommend that they go and get their own independent legal advice, because otherwise you can end up in the situation with them claiming, oh, we didn't understand, we didn't know what we're signing up to, we're not bound by the contract. So chuck that in there in any of your communications to try and help you enforce the contract if you need to.
So does that mean you're going to go to them and say, I think he's mentally defective?
Yeah, I think that would be the exact way to do it.
What about language barriers?
Yeah, and that's another thing that can be really, really complicated, is ensuring that they do understand, or that the reality is you can only do so much, right? You can't take someone along to a lawyer, get the interpreter there and get them to sign it all and make sure they're understanding it. But the main thing is that you're showing and giving them the opportunity to go and get help so that they can understand it. If they just want to proceed, and then that's on them at that point. But being seen to try and do the right thing is the way to go. But what's that saying? You can lead a horse to water. I'll get the contract signed. That might sound like I'm just being a really pedantic lawyer, but if you want your contract to be enforceable, get it signed. And it doesn't. Sorry, no.
I always heard that in actual fact a contract is enforceable if it's delivered upon. It doesn't need to be signed. Is there a specific reason why?
Depends what you're trying to rely on and enforce. So if you've got, contract is meeting of the minds. So sometimes that can be enough. You can have a verbal contract. You don't actually need a written one, but a verbal one is more likely to cause problems because people don't know what. This guy thinks they're doing one thing and this person thinks they're doing the other, and then they're talking at cross purposes. So getting it something in writing minimises the chance of that happening. And getting it signed is evidence that you are agreeing to those terms and conditions, particularly if you've got something like a limitation of liability in there and you want to rely on it. You need to show that the other person knew about it and agreed to it. Now you don't need to, physically sign it. You can have, emails to say, look, thanks for sending the contract through, all good from our perspective, please treat this as in lieu of our signature, or words to that effect, so that you've got a documentary trail showing that everyone was signing up to the same thing. It just reduces the chance of things going wrong and people misunderstanding where the lines are. Understanding who is the engineer to the contract. As Chris spoke about earlier, they do have a really, really important role, so it's good for you to understand who that person are, what their qualifications are, to work out how they're going to discharge their duties. What's the contract covering? So that's the scope, and one of the biggest, most contentious things that comes across my desk is where the scope of works changes, and that happens all the time, and that's fine, but do get that updated and ensure that the contract and your insurance covers both what was the old scope and what is the new scope. Have a clear documentary record of it, because what happens is when I'm at the bottom of the cliff trying to reconstruct what's happened, one, I'm just going to bug you with a million questions, which is really painful. So if you've got that document trail that you go, here, Kristal, just read this, it makes your life easier and mine. But also, it's really good evidence if we do end up in court to say, this is exactly what happened. Everyone knew exactly what was going on. There was no miscommunication at all, so that the whole claim is rubbish. It's a lot easier to do. Key clauses to consider. Is there a limitation of liability clause? So these are really common in the short form or long form agreements, particularly with consultants, engineers and architects. What that basically means is if they screw up, either contract, tort or under Fair Trading Act, then the most they will pay is the amount written in that clause. So it's often 5 times their fee up to a certain amount. So if it's say 500,000 but you're working on a $100 million building, if they do a faulty design and the whole building is screwed, the most that engineer will pay is $500,000. So look at that and work out who you're contracting with, what their risks are, and whether they've got one of these clauses. And the same for indemnity clauses. Be careful about if you're agreeing to take on someone else's risk, because that can undermine your insurance as well. If you're choosing to indemnify someone else and then they screw up, your insurer may not cover that. So just think about it, and if in doubt, check with your insurer whether that's something that they would cover if things go wrong. Producer statements, so these obviously come in a few different forms. Again, be really clear about what the producer statement is covering. Oftentimes we end up in big litigation where people are saying they relied on a producer statement, or between professionals or councils or building owners, and it's unclear what the producer statement was actually covering. So be really clear about what it's covering, and if it's not covering something, say that. And also have that limitation of liability clause in there as well. Insurance. So we've touched on a little bit about the different kinds of insurance, and Chris and Peter spoke a bit about the contracts works insurance. So that's, look, I know, I think most people's reaction when they hear the word insurance is, I'd rather stab myself in an eye with a blunt pencil than read an insurance policy or know what that is. And kind of fair enough, because it can be really boring, and people make it more boring than it is. So do take the time to understand what kind of insurance you need. And as I say, if you don't know or just don't want to know for whatever reason, because you're time poor and have got way better things to do, go and talk to a broker, a good one, and get them to find the right types of insurance for you. Because there's a whole bunch that may or may not be relevant to your business and different projects. So there's the contracts works we've covered, public liability. So this is your liability if someone else's property gets damaged during the work. Those policies often also cover legal defence costs. So if you do something that causes a fire and burns down the building next door, and then they turn around and sue you, your insurer pays for wonderful people like myself to come along and help you out. So it's a good thing to have. If you're a director of a company, directors and officers insurance, really important. Statutory liability we've covered. Cyber is a new area that's becoming more and more relevant. You'll hear more and more about cyber attacks and people being held to ransom, otherwise personal information is going to be released. That's important, because if you're holding someone's personal information, you do owe them privacy obligations, so that can come in handy. And then professional indemnity, that generally relates to when you're giving advice, and it relates to a specific type of advice that you're giving. So if you're taking out any of these insurances, look at the policy schedule. It's a wee piece of paper that comes with the policy. It's usually a one or two pager, and it'll set out really clearly what type of work is actually being covered. And if you read it and go, well, I only do the installation, why am I paying X amount for giving advice on design? Go and have a chat to someone because you might be paying for something you don't need. Really, really important. Understand what the insurance covers and what it doesn't. So that's where you're, reading an insurance policy is a weird thing. The way it's structured is it starts off with an operative clause. We will cover you for A, B, and C. There'll be some words in bold. They've got special definitions. Then they'll go down to sort of say, this defining the scope is we're going to cover this. Then they'll have some exclusions which carve it out after that. So it's really important you read those exclusions about what they don't cover. And then sometimes what's written back in is called the extensions, and that's quite common with the weather tightness extensions now. After the leaky building crisis, insurers just said, nah, we're not covering anything to do with weather tightness. Now they're sort of being brought back in as a bit of an extension, but they often have a sublimit. And what that means is your general policy will have a limit, sum insured. The most we will pay is $10 million. But sometimes those extensions will have their own little comments. So the most we'll pay for a leaky is $500,000 or whatever. So just check those amounts and make sure that they are commensurate with what your expectations are. Don't just look at the first line and go 10 million, sweet, we're good. Speak to a broker. As I say, someone else to sue. When things go wrong, what should you do? Document management and clear communication are your friends, both verbal and written. As I say, if you've got it in writing, it makes life so much easier, and there's nothing I take greater pleasure in is producing a little email to a lawyer on the other side saying, soz. So just get it in writing. It makes life so much easier, particularly if you're having a really key meeting with someone and you're agreeing to a scope change or something like that. Get it in writing, even if it's just a wee email afterwards. Thanks for meeting with us today. As discussed, 1, 2, 3. It's all it needs to be, and it's just a nice little file note. So if we end up here, it's a lot easier to get you out of that mess than otherwise. Work with your insurer and lawyer. I know we don't have the best reputations, but we're not all that bad. We are here to help you through these difficult times, and often what's in your insurer's best interest is actually in your best interest as well. They want these claims gone, just like you guys do. There can be different dynamics that you need to work through, such as what Brigitte was talking about before, where you've got client relationships and litigation. And that can be really, really tricky. And it's really important that people understand what is being asked of them and why. So sometimes, people say, oh, you've just got to shut up as soon as there's a claim. Well, understand why. It's important to understand why that is. And the reason for that is twofold, is your insurer doesn't want you to go and put your foot in it and make the situation a whole lot worse because you're putting your client relationship above the claim. And that might be a good business decision in some cases, but not always. If you do make it worse, and we could have got you off the hook, but for you saying, hey, I'm really sorry we screwed that entire construction of that building up, that's a big problem for them, because now they're going to have to pay out on something that they could have avoided. So understand what is being asked. If you're not sure and you've got these really important client relationships, go back to them and say, hey, I'm thinking of saying this for these reasons, and have that dialogue about what's acceptable to them. And that's all from me.